Hello, my name is Catherine Sendak, and welcome to CEPA's State of the Alliance, a series bringing together thought leaders from Europe and North America to deliberate the most pressing challenges facing allies and partners. Today, I am honored to welcome the Ambassador of Poland to the United States, His Excellency Marek Magierowski. Over the past year, Ukraine has skillfully and successfully defended itself and its European neighbors against Russia's aggression. Today, we reflect on the transatlantic community's role that they have and will have in ensuring Ukraine's victory. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for this kind invitation.
And on the series of State of the Alliance. We wanted to begin with your assessment of the alliance's support to Ukraine up to this point.
It's been pretty impressive. I think Putin miscalculated, and I'm not alone in this assessment. From the very beginning of the invasion, he thought that Europe would react more sluggishly and more leniently to this aggression, as it did many years ago after the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008 and also after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. We did impose sanctions as a collective West, so to speak, but then those sanctions were lifted and we were not adamant enough and determined enough to keep up the pressure on Russia and to stop Russia's neo-imperial ambitions. Now we have learned the lesson. This is at least my impression, the hard way, of course, because it's been a very painful and a very lengthy process. And on the other hand, it will be a protracted conflict. Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic about the duration of this war, although I am fairly optimistic about the final outcome, provided that we keep up the pressure, that we impose further packages of sanctions, which would finally cripple the Russian economy, because I believe this is what we need in order to crush the Russian armed forces in Ukraine proper.
Interesting. Well, to that point on sanctions and further actions that the alliance should be thinking about and taking, what is your assessment of the cohesion and security of the transatlantic alliance? And what, from your perspective, can we do in the year to come to increase that cohesion?
Well, actually, we have been talking quite intensely about the deepened cohesion of the North Atlantic Alliance, also within the European Union, not only among NATO members. Paradoxically, I can see some fissures and cracks still in the Western Alliance. Namely, you can see a certain realignment now with some countries which understand contemporary Russia much better than others. And I mean Poland, of course, our Central European neighbors, the Balts, but also the Scandinavians and the Anglo-Saxons. Maybe this is the legacy of the Cold War. Maybe we have remembered the Soviet Union's conduct and aggression and barbaric view of the world at the peak of the Cold War. Maybe there are some other factors which we should take into consideration. Nevertheless, I think that we should remember that, yes, Putin has paradoxically reinvigorated NATO. He has strengthened, for example, the European Union's foreign policy, which seemed to be a walking corpse until recently. But I'm glad that the European Union has regained its voice on the international arena, also in this particular confrontation with Russia. However, I do think that we have to work much harder in order to sustain this cohesion. Over the recent couple of weeks, especially when we remember all those conversations and talks and diplomatic spats, tug of war, in terms of our view of what we should do in order to arm Ukraine and to help Ukraine on the battleground more efficiently. There was a new alignment inside the European Union, for example. Okay, because so many countries have already committed themselves to delivering tanks, for example, to Ukraine. On the other hand, there is a troubling phenomenon now in the United States, especially after the midterms, with so many mostly Republican, but not only, but mostly Republican lawmakers expressing quite openly their misgivings about the necessity of continuing that aid. I've had a series of meetings with newly elected American lawmakers and also those who have expressed their doubts about, for example, the military expenditures which are aimed at helping Ukraine right now. They were using that argument that the American taxpayer is maybe paying too much for that assistance. And again, I had those meetings because I came to the conclusion that perhaps it doesn't make much sense to preach to the converted. You have to persuade all those people who may have their otherwise understandable doubts, because it's quite natural that all those politicians do converse with their own constituents, and the arguments they hear on a daily basis are of a completely different nature. An overwhelming majority of voters here in the United States are not particularly interested in what is going on in Ukraine. This is a common feature of all democracies, right? The constituents, the voters are mostly interested in domestic issues. But I do believe that, and I've also heard some assurances from other lawmakers on the Hill that there will be bipartisan support, unwavering, for Ukraine, because I think that perception of contemporary Russia as a symbol or an existential threat, not only to Ukraine and to the eastern flank of NATO, but also to Europe as such, and to the United States in the longer term, is quite real.
Yes, absolutely. You bring up a wonderful point about the consistent needs of Ukraine and its people. And I hope those meetings on the Hill were productive and went well. But to that end, Poland has been such a stalwart in the past year and further beyond, on support of all degrees to Ukraine, humanitarian
in various
support,
dimensions.
correct, yes. Financial aid, logistics, you name it. Poland has been so tantamount in that. I believe currently there are about 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees living in Poland.
Well, about 9 million refugees have crossed the border since the beginning of the hostilities. Of course, not all of them remained in Poland. Some re-emigrated to other countries, some of them returned to Ukraine. Roughly 2 million stayed in Poland, but you have to combine two figures. Those 2 million refugees and also approximately 1.5 million Ukrainian economic migrants who had lived and worked in Poland before the war. Yes. So Poland's population has increased by about 3 million people, 3.5 over the last couple of years. And they integrate seamlessly into the Polish society, into the Polish labor market, also because the unemployment rate in Poland is pretty low. So we can even physically absorb subsequent waves of Ukrainian refugees, and they enjoy many benefits. The Polish parliament passed a law just, I think, a month or two after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, which essentially facilitates their integration into the Polish society. They can set up their own businesses. They can send their children to Polish schools. We have incorporated more than 200,000 Ukrainian kids into the Polish schooling system, which has been quite a challenge. They can apply for Polish ID. And on the other hand, about 95% of those refugees are women and children. And those women, they never say, I want an allowance. They never say, I want welfare. I want the Polish authorities to take care of myself, of my family. They say, I want a job. Because they know very well that this is what they should do. And of course, their primary dream, so to speak, is to return to their homes in Ukraine. For the time being, it's impossible for many of them. But for example, our president has always called them guests and not refugees. And most of them, an overwhelming majority of those Ukrainian refugees have been hosted by Polish families in their Polish homes. It is a burden, of course, both in social and economic terms, but we do feel that this is our obligation, politically speaking, but also in terms of our, Christian character.
Sure, absolutely. To that end, Poland is in a unique positioned to understand the needs of the Ukrainian people and government moving forward. Is there anything specific that you can think of moving in the year ahead that from where you sit in Poland?
Ukraine has applied for membership in both the European Union and NATO. The Polish government's position has been pretty clear from the get-go on this. We do believe that Ukraine has deserved to become part of the West. And I'm using this term deliberately because this is something that reminds me of our path to not only to the European Union and to NATO, which are two symbolic political entities from our perspective, but also to the collective West. We had always aspired to be part of the West or of the free world, if you will. And I believe that Ukraine has already made some very essential, important steps in that direction. Of course, this process is usually pretty long and quite bumpy. But as I said, I believe that Ukraine has deserved that, and they have demonstrated that they are a European country, maybe even in some respects more European than many other European countries west of Poland.
I thank you for that. So, Mr. Ambassador, if we look at the European security situation as it stands now, the belief is that the continent and the free world, as you say, will ensure peace and stability through a clear Ukrainian victory. From your perspective, what does that victory look like?
First of all, I think that many Western politicians should change a little bit their vocabulary. The vocabulary and the terminology they use on a daily basis, because until recently they have been saying about the possibility of Ukraine not losing the war to Russia. Now, an increasing number of Western political leaders are using another term, Ukraine's victory. And I think it's good. It is a very good and a positive signal that we are sending also to the Kremlin, which somehow determines our long-term approach to this very concept of arming Ukraine as long as it takes. And we should do our utmost to ensure Ukraine's victory on the ground. And again, it will be a very protracted conflict. We should not expect immediate positive results, but I believe this is what we should be saying on a daily basis. We need to keep arming Ukraine because it is also in our interest. They are fighting not only for their own freedom, for their own sovereignty, but they are fighting also for ours. And if we don't stop Putin now arming Ukraine, he will return with a vengeance. And as I've already said on numerous occasions here, Poland may be the next item on his menu. For the time being, I don't believe that he will dare attack one of NATO member states. Still, we have to be prepared for every eventuality.
Absolutely. And finally, from that perspective, are there any long-term resilience measures that the alliance should be considering to boost the defense and deterrence in Europe?
We are in a kind of a twilight zone because we were not thinking in the wildest dreams of the possibility of a regular land warfare in Central Europe, actually in the 21st century, which somehow reminds us of World War I warfare, trenches, artillery. This is something pretty unusual and I think surprising for people who are not exactly military experts. But speaking of resilience and deterrence, I think that unlike during the Cold War, the world economy or economies are deeply intertwined right now, which has its upsides and its downsides. So if we are ready to acknowledge that we are in a long-term, we are engaged in a long-term confrontation with Russia, we have to take all necessary steps and we have to contemplate all possible measures to win this clash, to prevail in this confrontation, including also economic punitive measures, which, as I said, have not yet kicked in. I think that the Russian society and the Russian economy has yet to feel the pinch of those sanctions. On the other hand, we are still too reliant on the Russian economy, on the Russian gas and oil supplies. And I think that we should, well, again, it's been a very hard lesson to learn. Germany, for example, went from 55, 56% of its reliance on imports of Russian gas to zero. So it turns out that it was possible, as opposed to what many experts had been saying until recently. It is possible for us to decouple ourselves from oil and gas imports from Russia, as Poland did just a few months ago. So actually, since October last year, we have been entirely independent of imports of Russian commodities. So this is, again, we have to arm ourselves with patience, because, as I said, there will be no immediate staggering results of those economic sanctions. But I think that there are also boundaries to even Russia's resilience in that respect.
Committed to the long term. Yes,
absolutely.
Absolutely. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining
My
us
pleasure.
today.
Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in to this conversation on State of the Alliance, hosted by CEPA. Be sure to visit CEPA.org and follow CEPA's social media accounts to stay up to date on the latest events and analysis.